After the release of Pokemon Red and Green, Pokemon took over the world. On TV, on food, on toys, on stage. It was everywhere. With its success, the world can't get enough and wants more Pokemon. A game created by a small team simply making the game that they wanted to play, that beat the odds and caught lightning in a bottle for a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. And now, they have to do it again. This is the story of Pokemon Gold and Silver.
The history of Pokemon Gold and Silver starts with the release of Pokemon Red and Green, publicly announced in 1996 and slated for release in 1997. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't release until 1999. Stick around to find out why. Pokemon Gold and Silver was to feature new and returning Pokemon, as well as new starters, Chikorita, Kurusu, and Hanaguma. What's wrong? Not who you were expecting? Let me explain.
But first, we need a little bit of a history lesson about the first Pokemon game. If you want, you can also just watch the previous video on it here. But one more time. Satoshi Tajiri sets out to create a game based off of his childhood love of collecting bugs. Inspired by the Game Boy's connection cable, the Game Link cable, he sets out to make a game about connection. He imagines little bugs going up the wire to be traded with friends. That game became Pokemon. Pokemon Red and Green's popularity grows massive in Japan, mostly due to word of mouth. Nintendo wants a sequel. They call it Pokemon 2. However, the first Pokemon game was in development for 6 years, and Game Freak was running out of money.
Pokemon 2 would be delayed for multiple reasons. 1, Game Freak was still making non-Pokemon games to keep the company afloat. 2, they were working on Pokemon Blue, an upgraded version of Pokemon Red and Green that you can hear about in my previous video. Also, they were working on localizing Pokemon for the West. That last one would cause some issues because in order for them to localize it for the West, it would need to be completely reprogrammed. So all that took time. But when development for Pokemon 2 did start, Tajiri was determined to create a premium Pokemon experience.
Instead of the new location being based off of one location in Japan like the first game, Tajiri envisions the game being inspired by the entirety of Japan. This version of the game had a remarkably similar beginning to Red and Blue, with you meeting Professor Oak and him giving you the Pokédex and starters. The starters, however, were different. You had Chikorita, Kurusu, which looks like a baby Nessie, and Hanaguma, which was a little bear. The map was intended to be bigger than the first game, but because of memory limitations, things were closer together, making the world feel smaller. They also created around 200 Pokemon for the first game, but they narrowed that down to 150. But at one point, during Tajiri's development of Gold and Silver, they had over 350 Pokemon they had to choose from. Tajiri would admit that Pokemon's development wasn't going as good as he would hope for. Admittedly, he had spent the last 6 years working on Pokemon Red and Green, so he probably needed a break. And so Junichi Masuda will work on recreating Gold and Silver according to his vision. But one thing that wouldn't change between Masuda's version and Tajiri's is the desire to make it better than Pokemon Red and Green. I hate when people smoke on the train. Who's that Pokemon? It's Tyranitar! Junichi Masuda wants the setting of the game to be reminiscent of older cities in Japan, so he starts researching regions in Kyoto and Nara, saying, I knew I wanted to focus on towers, and those cities had those old kind of Japanese towers, and that's where the inspiration came from. Kyoto was once the capital of Japan from 794 to 1868. It was the center of both culture and politics. When the capital moved to Tokyo, Kyoto became known for art and culture while holding on to its traditional values. Eventually, Masuda travels to Kyoto and immerses himself in the culture, history, and art. He visits places like the pagoda at the Toji Temple and hears stories such as the one about the burned down West Temple, which would inspire him to incorporate the burned down tower into the game. Masuda's trip to Kyoto gave birth to the Johto region, the setting for Pokemon Gold and Silver. Johto meaning capital of castles, reflecting how both Johto and Kyoto are filled with castles and palaces, and how Kyoto was once the capital of Japan. Tajiri's version of the game was based off the entirety of Japan and used names like Mount Fuji, Old City, and Silent Hill. Masuda's version would go back to the naming convention of the first game and name towns after colors, like Violet City and Goldenrod. Also, I can't be the only one who wants a Silent Hill game based in the Pokemon world after hearing that, right?
After the trip, the team started to rapidly develop the game. They had several delays, and they knew they were going to miss their release date. And they still need to figure out which Pokemon were going to be in the game. They cut out a lot of the Pokemon from the Tajiri version, including the starters Kurusu and Hanaguma, and replaced them with
Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile.
Throughout the development process, they were still trying to figure out which Pokemon would be in the actual game. After the development process was done, the debugging process took about 6 months, and up until the very end, they were still trying to figure out which Pokemon would make the cut. To figure this out, they went back to unused Pokemon designs from Pokemon Green and Red, and they also took inspiration from a whole bevy of places, including animals that exist in the real world, mythological creatures. They even thought about taking inspiration from Dolly the cloned sheep.
The game would also be getting an upgrade. Whereas the first game was released on the Game Boy, Gold and Silver would be released on the Game Boy Color, introducing a world of color to the world of Pokemon.
With the advent of color came a new kind of Pokemon, shiny Pokemon. Shiny Pokemon are exactly like regular Pokemon, just a little bit different and a little rarer. Now I know it seems silly. Shiny Pokemon are just palette swapped versions of their counterparts. But, man, if it doesn't get your dopamine going when you catch one, and it's absolutely devastating when you miss it.
Who's that Pokemon? It's Slowpoke! And they didn't get rid of every idea from Tajiri's version of Gold and Silver. Several things carried over, like the introduction of 2 new types, Dark and Steel. This would help balance the game type-wise, giving another weakness to Psychic and Ghost types, which were largely seen as overpowered. Some Pokemon from the previous gen would be retroactively changed, like Magnemite and Magneton. They both became Steel Electric, while the move Bite would go from being normal to dark. These balance and tweaks help to improve the general gameplay by allowing players to not get completely overwhelmed by one particular type. The other thing that carried over was tinier and cuter. Baby Pokemon were pre-evolved Pokemon forms. You had Togepi, Pichu, Jigglypuff, Cleffa, and more. Baby Pokemon were added as a result of introducing a new mechanic, Pokemon breeding. In order to breed, you need a male and female Pokemon, or a Ditto, a genderless Pokemon that can breed with any gender Pokemon or any genderless Pokemon. This ability makes it the only way to breed with Pokemon that have no gender. One of the advantages to breeding in Generation 2 is the ability to pass on egg moves that can only be learned through inheriting it through a parent. Now Pokemon had 2 new types, Shinies, and the ability to breed, all in an attempt to make this game better than the last. The next thing they needed was time. They added a real-time clock, not to the Game Boy, but to the cartridge itself by adding a chip and a battery so the game could keep time even when you weren't playing. This was important to gameplay because some Pokemon would only be available during certain times of the day or certain days of the week. And when the sun went down, that's when the nocturnal Pokemon came out to play. The day will be broken up into 3 different parts: morning, which ran from 4 a.m. to 9:59 a.m., day, which runs from 10 a.m. to 5:59 p.m., and night, which runs from 6 p.m. to 3:59 a.m. 10 o'clock in the real world was 10 o'clock in the game. I believe this added another layer of connection between the player and the Pokemon. So, hear me out. Some Pokemon are rarer than others, but by having certain Pokemon appear at certain times of the day or the week ensured that players had to be more conscious of how they caught the Pokemon. Let's say you were a kid who was only allowed to play a game at a certain time of the day. This meant certain Pokemon were not available to you. You either had to actively adjust your real-life schedule, or you had to find someone to trade with. This intentional effort meant a strong connection with whatever Pokemon you were trying to get. Sure, Hoot is a common nocturnal Pokemon, but if you're not able to play at night, then it becomes rare to you. The clock made catching certain Pokemon far more intentional, thereby increasing your bond.
They put a lot of thought and effort into everything that they did to make sure that you and your Pokemon had a... Even the way the Pokemon sits next to you in battle is supposed to evoke this sense that it's standing next to you, a companion fighting by your side. Get 'em!
It's Scissor!
Now, if you're paying attention, you probably realize that there's one Pokemon that I haven't mentioned. But before I talk about them, we first need to talk about the Pokemon anime. The Pokemon anime and the games have always had a sort of symbiotic relationship. One of the producers, Tsuneku Ishihara, was actually against the anime airing because at the time, shows based off video games didn't last that long, and he thought it would be detrimental to the franchise if the Pokemon anime was cancelled before Gold and Silver had been released.
However, a year later in 1998, Gail Tilden is heading the localization of Pokemon Red and Blue for the US and decides to release the anime and the game simultaneously instead of solely relying on the game to launch the franchise. And during Gold and Silver's longer than expected development process, the show would help keep Pokemon relevant even while development lagged. The show was and is a huge part of the franchise's success, even with the incident. Pokemon Shock was an incident that sent multiple children to the hospital by causing them seizures. The story behind it is covered in my previous Pokemon video. The Pokemon anime stops production while Japan investigates. While executives were dealing with the massive fallout of the TV giving children seizures, they had less time to oversee the creatives, which meant that Takeshi Shudo, the head writer for the Pokemon anime and the script writer for Pokemon 2000, had full creative freedom of Pokemon X, a mysterious Pokemon he was tasked with creating.
And Shudo made it Flying Psychic. Flying because it looks like a bird, and Psychic because, as I said earlier, psychics were considered to be really powerful. Thus, Shudo released his Pokemon, Lugia.
Game designer Shigeki Morimoto explained that while Ho-Oh and Lugia do not have a direct connection in the story of Gold and Silver, they were envisioned being born in the world of Pokemon Gold and Silver for its new feature, the time system, giving us the day and night cycle. Thus, they represent the sun and the moon, the day and the night. And ironically, both Ho-Oh and Lugia debuted in the anime before they were seen in the game. Lugia and Ho-Oh being featured as mascots for Pokemon Gold and Silver would also start a long tradition of legendary Pokemon being mascots for their respective games. At this point, you might have noticed the game is getting rather big, so how would they fit all of it on one cartridge? First, let's clear up something you might have heard. Future Nintendo President Satoru Iwata, while not yet a Nintendo employee, was working as president of HAL Laboratories and a board member of Creatures Inc., where he acted as a liaison for Nintendo and the Pokemon development team. He helped with the localization of Pokemon Red and Green for overseas markets. This meant analyzing the game's source code and suggesting ways to adapt it for different regions. Iwata provided critical programming assistance during Gold and Silver's development. The game's development team was notably small, with only 4 programmers. There is a widespread and persistent rumor that Iwata wrote a compression algorithm that significantly increased the storage space in Gold and Silver. Even some in-game dialogue in Ultra Sun and Moon by a character resembling Morimoto seemed to support this, mentioning an amazing guy who solved the data problem and later became a real big company president. However, analysis of Gold and Silver games data reveals that this rumor is false. Iwata's algorithm actually decreased the amount of storage space by a few percentage points, not increased it. Its primary purpose was speed, not size. What actually happened was that halfway through Pokemon Gold and Silver's development, they upgraded to 8 megabit cartridges. Masuda would say, "Oh my god, double the space." That freedom in size allowed the game scope to double.
But what would they do with all that space? Put an entirely different Pokemon game on there. In Pokemon Gold and Silver, after you beat the main game, you have the option to go to Kanto, the region in the previous game, and fight the gym leaders there.
Imagine the awe that everyone felt realizing that they could go back and revisit the first game. Who's that Poké?
Why is it lumpy?
It's got a long neck.
Pika!
Oh, it's Pikachu! Pokémon Gold and Silver were initially released in Japan on November 21st, 1999, North America on October 11, 2000, Australia on October 13, 2000, Europe on April 6, 2001. After that, Game Freak released Pokémon Crystal, the third and final game of the second generation of Pokémon. Pokémon Crystal, released in 2000, featured unique animation for each Pokémon, a female protagonist, and more stress for programmers. No Bagasaara, the translator for Pokémon, was originally excited when he first saw. But then Agasaara realized there wasn't any gender-specific text. This meant there was no room for X has come to battle, where X can either be he, she, or they. Without the ability to use pronouns, they start using gender-neutral terms like pipsqueak and squirt. All three games released to commercial and critical success.
If it's not obvious already, Pokemon left a lasting impact on me. I remember being a kid and going places with my Game Boy and seeing parking lots, parks, anything, and just imagining Pokemon living in that space. And imagining to myself, what would it be like if Pokemon were real and we truly lived in a Pokemon world? What was your favorite Pokemon Gold and Silver memory? Comment below. Make sure to hype this video. I said hype, not like. And you can like it as well. You should like it as well. Also, make sure you